Okay, why don't we get started? I'm really excited to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Michelle Addington, our dean, who will be speaking at City Forum today. I think a lot of us certainly know Dean Addington, but we kind of know her as the administrative leader of the school, and we know her as the keynote at school-wide events and ceremonies and so on and so forth. But Dr. Addington is a really prominent leading scholar at the national and international levels on building systems and an advocate for a kind of fundamental rethinking of how we understand efficiency in the built environment. I first ran across Michelle's work 9 years ago when I was just sort of foraging for a seminar that I was teaching, and I read her material, and it just completely dismantled my lazy understanding of how to conceptualize efficiency in building systems. So I don't know exactly what she's going to talk about today, but I think you'll leave here with a lot of profound questions and new ideas about how to think about this domain. So,
thanks, Michael. I am so grateful for City Forum, for Michael and the CRP program for inviting me to do this, because I actually haven't had a chance to speak to anyone here about what I do, what I think about. I had lectured here twice, but we're probably talking in some cases decades ago, or not quite decades ago, but I lectured on advanced materials probably at least 10 years ago, and did lecture on energy balancing, but probably about 15 years ago. So this is really my first opportunity to do this. One of the sort of things before I get going on this is that this is what I'm presenting for you today is not a lifetime's worth of work. It is a lifetime worth of rethinking my work and trying to sort of understand particularly why it is that we have not been making the progress that we so desperately need to be making in this particular kind of field. And I would say that my point of view toward that changes sort of like each path that I go down, sort of each thread that I tease out. It forces me to also go back and rethink why I had that particular view on things. So I just wanted to sort of kick off and remind everybody about really within the building industry that there have been three sort of trends in sort of thinking about issues of sustainability that we are left with what they've encoded into our practices. Certainly in the first one, when it was assumed, it was form, that it was all about form. The thing that we make, of course, if this is a thing that we make, then it should be one and the same with the surfaces we make and the forms that we make. The next version of it came about in terms of thinking about what best practices were. That sort of, we know what we're supposed to do, we just need somebody to legislate us into doing it. And that was quite the approach that we had, first with the unbelievable pace at which building codes for energy have been implemented. For those of you who are familiar with the building industry, the one thing you know is that there is nothing that sort of progresses at a slower pace than getting building codes updated. We probably have still plumbing codes, I think World War II, for some of the plumbing codes. Really difficult. A lot of it has to do with the fact that the trades control a lot of the codes. Energy codes have been exactly the opposite. The rate at which energy codes have been introduced, replaced again and again and again. I actually have, I didn't have time to show it here, but I have sort of a running animation of every time a code changed in the state, over a 10-year period, which was absolutely astonishing to see what was happening in the country very, very rapidly within that. And of course, sort of fitting along with it, and I think something that most people know about, all of this idea of best practices is what has been encoded into all of our different types of rating systems. So again, this sort of belief We know what we need to do. We either need to sort of like make people do it by law, or we need to sort of like have the carrot out there to encourage them to do that. And of course, we're in sort of the third phase of all of this, where it's become not so much about the buildings, but all the things we put in the buildings, particularly sort of like the advanced technologies. And that's kind of the era that we're in right now, where there's an incredible sort of attention to smart buildings. I'm all for smart buildings. It's incredible attention for smart buildings, but in many ways, if you think about the early days of it all being about the form, way too much about the form, by the way, to now, it's like, okay, really not so much about what we're making. It's kind of giving us a buy on saying, you can make whatever you want to make. You know, it's really about sort of these other little add-ons that you're going to bring into play. So this is where we are pretty much right now. So I want to step back to what was perhaps a big sea change for me in my thinking. I've never been a fan of any of these approaches, by the way, but what was a big sort of sea change for me in my thinking took place for the Conference of Parties 15. I hope everybody knows when I say Conference of Parties, that's the UN climate accords that take place every single year. You know, the Kyoto Protocol came from one, the Paris Accords came from one. I fortunately got to participate in the one in Cancun that took place a while back, and I was asked to put together a session by the chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, wanting me to sort of address the fact that there had not been progress in buildings, and could I pull together individuals from both developing and developed countries to talk about how we might share information, something that would sort of raise everyone's profile and everyone's, not everyone's profile, but everyone's sort of understanding of what types of things truly were universal, what types of things were truly quite specific to their locale and their country. And I worked for a year on developing this symposium to sort of go along with the climate accords, involved energy ministers from Denmark, from India, researchers from Germany. So it was quite a cross-cutting type of thing. And in preparation for it, we were also working then with the UN environmental program, and I was sent 2 slides to help me prepare for this. And so this is one that was sent to me by UNEP, and they said, listen, why aren't buildings making any kind of difference when it's clear that buildings are the low-hanging fruit? What was the point of this slide was to show that this is potential greenhouse gas emission reduction. So the fact that buildings had the lion's share of potential for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And then the other slide that I was sent from the UN to sort of focus on was this sort of very well-known one from McKinsey that has, this is their low-hanging fruit. Anything in the green means it's a win-win. You save money and you get greenhouse gas reduction. So of course, everybody does low-hanging fruit. And if you notice, if the previous slide, buildings had the lion's share there, here the same thing is true. Insulation, lighting, air conditioning, water heating, standby losses. So almost all of the low-hanging fruit were buildings. And so the question that was being posed to me was, clearly, you've got this stuff. We know that you ought to be able to do this. Why aren't you doing it? You know, what's the problem here? Why aren't you doing that? So in the year of preparing for putting together this session, I decided to read all the different countries' approaches to sort of like understanding energy reduction, particularly in relationship to buildings. And so this is just a smattering of some of the different documents that I went through in preparing for this. And one of the things I noticed as I went through it is there was a particular statement that showed up in document after document after document. It didn't matter whether it was coming from the United States, from the UN, from India, from Germany, but it was this statement. It showed up again and again and again. That energy consumption in both new and existing buildings could be cut by an estimated 30 to 50% by 2030 through readily available technologies, design, equipment, management systems, and alternative generation solutions. And of course, you can see why the UN had that thing like, okay, that number, 30 to 50% is big. So of course, you know, ka-ching on that chart, that's why you defined it as being the place of the low-hanging fruit, and the same thing as McKinsey. The problem is that not only did I not know what those were, I was really troubled that the same statement showed up over and over again. Most of the time, it wasn't sourced. It didn't have attribution. But a couple of times, it did. And of course, if it was cited, it would go back to something written, you know, perhaps a year before, that also didn't explain what these technologies are, where they came from. So I embarked on a paper trail of figuring out where did this come from and what are they talking about? Because I would like to know how they calculated 30 to 50%, how they knew that these technologies were the ones that everybody around the world needed to adopt overnight to save our planet. I did not know what they were. So it took a while, and what happened is when I finally traced to the origin, it ended up going back to a paper written in the early 90s that was a study of 12 homes in Southern California done by a particular builder where they were sort of choosing between particular technologies there. The choice of technologies for those 12 homes, you know, outside of Los Angeles, did get this difference. But it was sort of very specific things that were done for 12 homes done by a single builder. Nobody was disingenuous in the way that that sort of progressed through the system. It's just that every time it was cited, a little bit of information gets dropped off. The first thing that it was 12 homes. Next, that it was in Southern California. Next, that they were all sort of built at the same time with these very particular sort of choice of technologies within that. And so what happens, it goes from being that study to becoming worldwide doctrine on this. Nobody questioning along the way. And just to sort of like continue on that vein, I sit on an advisory board at Princeton, and usually at our annual meeting, you know, we have somebody different from the energy industry talking. And a couple of years ago, it was the undersecretary for DOE. And then you can see, yes, it's not exactly the same quote, but energy technology, 20 to 35%. And when I questioned him at the end, he goes, oh, it's a well-known fact that this has been well demonstrated on that. He actually also did not know what those technologies are. So I went down a very different path in my work after having done this particular session and done all the preparation for this session. I kept thinking, you know, how do I begin to sort of like peel back? How do I begin to sort of unpack, or how do I begin to sort of dismantle what are a series of prevalent beliefs that people have that are actually keeping us from moving forward? You know, if you think about that sort of 20 to 35% quote, the fact that people around the world, world leaders from around the world, think that the problem is just specification, is just an act of will, you're not going to get the attention to the type of research, the type of analysis that would actually mean any kind of substantive change within this field. So I started trying to think within, you know, my own field, where were we going awry in how we were teaching? Where are we going awry in how we were communicating? So I'm going to go through sort of a series of where I call sort of like missteps, you know, mistranslations, miscommunications, and I'm just going to give you a snippet as we go through of sort of different ways that sort of miscommunications across from our discipline to another discipline or within our discipline have kind of kept us sort of frozen in place on this. And the examples might seem a little far afield, but they're meant to illustrate all the different ways that, let's just say, not just bad knowledge, but bad information keeps us from developing good knowledge on this. First is sort of like misattribution, and this is one of my favorite examples, and some of the students in the audience have already seen this one. Like many people, I got my start in having to teach you know, construction technology and things like that. And when I first started teaching, this was an example given to me as, you know, you have to teach your students all about this louver system and how amazing this louver system is for producing the ideal light in a space. And when I was given that, I thought, this is not a good idea. It can't be a good idea. So I got a small grant so I could go down, and as I always do when I'm really bothered about the way I don't think something works and not possible, my grants always involve climbing on roofs, going in basements, climbing through things, and actually looking at their data of how things work. So I have to apologize for the next couple of slides because this was done really early on, back in the days when it was all actual film, slides, as opposed to something digital, and they didn't translate very well. And unfortunately, a lot of mine were damaged, so I've only been able to recover a couple of them. But when I got up in the roof, the thing I started noticing is all the places where the roof was covered. And one of the things I discovered when I started matching inside and out is that the covering occurred any place there was art. So you had the roof sort of designed as a skylight system in the lobby and in some of the corridors and wherever there was sculpture. Particularly stone sculpture, very insensitive, not a fugitive art. But anytime you were dealing with painting, covered over. When you got to sensitive painting, double covered over. Ceiling on the inside as well as covered on the top. Occasionally what they would do in some of the places that actually did deal with paintings, they'd allow a little opening to do a little bit of wall washing. But the thought that this louver system created all of this sort of like light that was going to be used, not so. And the reality is, now this is a more recent one, you can walk in and tell. Anybody can walk in to the Manil and tell what's covered and what's not covered. It's just people aren't thinking about the fact that some of this is covered and some of this is not covered. And yet we continue to sort of like push forward the idea that we have to have this kind of sort of incredible, even, homogeneous lighting that not only is really bad for almost anything you want to do in a building, but also incredibly energy intensive when you start thinking about it in places like Houston, where you have an enormous amount of roof load from the sun. But these are the kinds of things that we're all taught. It's taught to us as precedent. We studied as precedent. That becomes our best practices, because this is what we're taught. So the things that we think of are best practices. Many of these are these things that we actually sort of like never investigated. We just attribute good behavior to them. We attribute value to them on that. The next one is sort of misassumption, and this is going to be another museum building in another location. And this is Lou Kahn's great last building that he did. Actually was completed after his death, the Yale Center for British Art. These are the skylights in the building, and little did I know, or anybody else at the architecture school know, but the building, well, we knew that the building was about to be shut down for a major renovation. What we didn't know is that during the renovation, they were going to rotate all of the skylights. The skylights in the building all face south. Like anybody knows, skylights in art buildings should face north. So their assumption was all skylights had to rotate. Clearly they were installed incorrectly because Kahn had died. So whoever was sort of like doing it put the skylights in the wrong direction. Well, we didn't know that they were planning on doing this. And so it was only because we had put together an exhibit about the actual lighting designer, Richard Kelly, and we had his archived notebooks that his daughter had donated to the exhibition, and someone, the director of the Yale Center for British Art, saw this particular tiny notebook. I'm amazed at how much she paid attention. And there was this sort of like drawing about the skylight, and then an explanation that it had to face south. It had to face south because it would have less ultraviolet in it. And so I got a phone call from the different directors of the different museums at Yale, and they said, what's going on here? Skylights face north. Why did Richard Kelly think they had to face south? And I said, oh, of course it has to face south. in terms of ultraviolet. If ultraviolet's what you're concerned about. So I put on a class for all of the museum directors and the museum personnel, and I explained exactly why the sky was blue, where ultraviolet was, and, and walk them through that, they're confusing the fact that if you think about 1 square foot of south light versus 1 square foot of north light, of course, 1 square foot of south light is more damaging. But that's not how we light spaces. We light it on a lumen by lumen level. 1 lumen of south light has about 40% to 60% less ultraviolet than 1 lumen of north light. It also comes in a smaller area. So I did that, and they agreed. The skylights did not rotate. But a couple of years after they completed that, I was invited over to the new Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage, which was about 10 miles down the road. And the director there wanted to proudly show me their new north-facing skylights. And you can even tell. You can see the blueness up there. And so I said, Stefan, you were in the front row when I gave that lecture. And he goes, I know, but I thought you were just talking about the Center for British Art. And I said, no, Northern Hemisphere. Everything above the equator going north is what I was talking about. And one of the things he said is, he says, but we've always used north light in museums, always. And so this started a couple-year conversation where he would call me, and he goes, I can't find any research papers that tell me that we should, that tell me that south light is better than north light. I said, it's actually just physics. It's something that if you'd taken 2 semesters of physics in college, it would have been in semester 2 under physical optics. That's where it would have shown up. Maybe you only had 1 semester, but you have a PhD in chemistry. I would have hoped you would have had 2. But he wouldn't let go of the fact that he wanted to see data. He wanted to see data, he wanted to see a research paper, but no amount of explaining the science of how light scattered in the atmosphere was going to work for him. He really thought that it had to be a research paper. And I bring up this particular example, as obscure as it is, because I think it's one of the most difficult things that we deal with in our fields. We often talk about people who are science deniers. We've got a lot of science deniers who are really good scientists. Often when something sort of challenges their set of expectations, I've been fascinated by how quickly they sort of push back and ask to see a research paper rather than walk through the calculations, rather than, actually sort of like reason out and learn what's going on. And this is sort of a really good example of that. He's still, by the way, asking me if I could just send him a paper that would explain this. And he hasn't appreciated the fact that I sent him a chapter from a textbook. Misinterpretation. I think this is the most pernicious one that we deal with. And it's taken me a long time to understand why it is that we do such poor energy analyses on buildings. How on earth did anyone ever conceive of the type of energy analysis that we do and think that it's a good idea? And this is my sort of like proposition on this. One thing we know in buildings, when we start talking about forces in buildings, we understand structure. We understand statics. And the thing that's really beautiful about statics and forces is that it's completely sort of like coplanar and collinear with the things that we make. We make a wall, we understand the forces that are carried through the wall. We can completely sort of understand forces in this particular way. And it doesn't matter how complex it gets. We get it. We get that how forces demonstrate, how forces are carried to the ground can be and will be sort of like resolved through the thing that we make, which is a structural system, which is also the thing that we understand in terms of the scale of a building. The problem is that works really well for statics. It doesn't work for any other kind of energy that we deal with. This is a basic diagram about how to do an energy balance. So if that was a force balance, this is an energy balance, sort of, and a very classic one for a thermodynamic system. And it's the kind of thing that when it simplifies, kind of looks like this. You know, a blob, that's a state. But people look at this particular thing and they think, oh, I'm going to map it exactly the same way I do a force diagram. I'm going to map it straight onto the building. I can treat the whole building as if it's, you know, a singular thermodynamic system. I could look at the whole sort of edge of the building as if I'm dealing with two distinct thermodynamic systems, and I'm just dealing with that crossover. So this is the way that most of our energy balances come from. And it's sort of, it's so ingrained in the way that we think, you know, it shows up in everything that we think about. You know, this sort of great image from James Marston Fitch, that everything now, that boundary for a thermodynamic system is also the boundary that we make. It's the envelope that we make. Everything happens there. It's like a magical boundary. It can do anything because it's the thing that we make and that we know. And it's why we end up with things that seriously, if you don't read this and think this is the most perverse thing you've ever heard of, I know you've kind of drunk the Kool-Aid in me. Build tight and ventilate right. Make your home as tight as you possibly can, and then make sure that whatever air comes in is fully mechanically conditioned. This is bizarre. This is really perverse on this. You know, so the thought that the only way you can be healthy in a building is if you have an HVAC system cleaning that apparently very, very dangerous air that's outside, cleaning it for you on this. And that's why we also end up with things like this. You know, so we can think about this and laugh about this. It's the same premise here. The idea of the passive house is also sort of meant sort of building this sort of incredible barrier to the exterior, controlling all of the air that's inside, because you really wouldn't want any of that contaminated outside air possibly affecting your breath. But coming back to this, this is what a real diagram looks like here. What would be the perfect manifestation or demonstration of this? It's this. This is the perfect manifestation, demonstration of how thermodynamic, how heat moves. It's never fixed to location. It's always contingent. It emerges and disappears and dissipates within that. How do we sort of map that onto the way that we think about our very static buildings? This is the last one of these I'm doing. This is my most favorite one of these. Misappropriation, where we think we know how something works and we're going to sort of like spirit it into place and use it. Joe Paradiso is an old friend, and he was the first one. And it was really just out of fun that he did this at MIT 20 years ago, was to talk about the piezoelectric shoe. You know, the shoe that if you put a piezoelectric, usually sort of a very small device, in the heel, every time you stepped on it, it would flex, and in the flexure created a current. You're going to make energy from it. Lots of people did things with this over the years. You know, just you could light up some things with it, lots of things. But, you know, mostly it was for fun stuff. And he really enjoyed working on this, and he loved seeing how it proliferated out there. What he wasn't expecting is when suddenly someone said, by the way, they're using it in Tokyo. It's embedded into all of these floor mats, and they're making huge amounts of energy because a lot of people use that subway. And we suddenly started seeing proposals for this everywhere. This dance floor that gets completely lit by people dancing on it. That it's all piezoelectric on that. And then it just goes roughshod from there. You know, everybody talking about, oh, this is it. This is our answer. You know, we're going to make all of our energy from just sort of installing piezoelectric tiles for people to step on. And it got to the point that one of my colleagues at Yale, who's her entire research was on piezoelectric, said, I just have to put an end to this. So she built this installation. You probably can't tell, it's a Breuer building there in the background. It was meant for the public to come down here and sort of experiment with this. And it did everything from exactly where your foot landed on it, how large the piezoelectric was, how many times, how much you weighed. It was fairly detailed. It went over a course of a summer. And what the conclusion of it was, and I think it's really what put this to rest for a while, is that you could make some energy from this. That if you took these tiles, you put them in the busiest corner in Times Square, that at the end of the day, you could turn on one lamp for about an hour. So you could do that. Of course, the amount of embodied energy that was going to go into making the tile, a whole different thing. But while it hasn't quieted down as much, I was really a little shocked some years later when I was at the Biennale and to go over and see what one of my colleagues had done there. And I hadn't realized they were going to install them floor, and she thought I'd be so impressed when I realized they were including this sort of like new next generation energy generating floor that was going to solve all of our problems. I do know how the floor works. It does have piezoelectrics on it, and it generates just enough energy to sort of like flip the switch to turn the lights on. So that's what it can flip the switch to turn the lights on. It actually doesn't produce nearly enough to actually power any of those lights. So I put these out there as sort of a series of different ways that, whether it's through belief, whether it's through the fact that we don't sort of like appropriately source or cite anything, that we kind of assume that knowledge transfers over, but we're also sort of reading it through our own lens, is that we're kind of left with a set of practices and approaches that really have not done us well within this. And I'm not demanding or asking our profession to do better on this. We're not the scientists who developed that information. So the question really does start to boil down to how it is that we appropriate, how it is that we communicate, and how it is that we transfer knowledge when we're not the owners of that knowledge. And I think even more problematically for it, it's not that we're not the owners of that knowledge, but often don't even know where the owners of that knowledge is. It's really quite interesting for me. So I wanted to sort of put forward a couple of lessons and questions on this. And the first one is there are no heroic solutions. It's always being posed to me because of the fact that I work in this field. Someone always has an answer. I said last month the answer was it's solved. We're going to grow all of our own building materials. We don't have to worry about anything. We just have to sort of get that knowledge out there. It's almost always something. It was for a while, it was that energy generating floor that was going to solve a lot of things. Now it's like we're going to grow all of our own building materials. There's always something like that, and people really want there to be this sort of quick, fast, easy solution. It really takes an enormous amount of pressure off of us if there's that easy solution. So I think about different kinds of better questions, and these are more questions that might relate to my own work. I'm really interested in questions that ask the why behind the things we take for granted. What started my own work many, many years ago really had to do with sort of understanding the human body and how the human body exchanged heat with its surroundings. Because I never could understand why we would choose to sort of like deal with heating and cooling a building when it's really just my body. Why are we dealing with this gigantic building, all the systems, the enormous amount of fan energy when it's just my body, within that. And so things that I learned in it that I've always been interested in, and I'm still interested in to this day, is that we could do everything the body needs two ways. All convective exchange happens within a centimeter of the skin. But we can also, that would be how we would manage humidity. All temperature exchange I can do radiantly. As long as I get something somewhere around my neck or somewhere on my forehead, I could eliminate a heating and cooling system in order to manage the body. It's not hard. The part that's hard about this is that the type of HVAC systems that we use today come from a belief about the human body from the late 19th century. And it actually was a belief that was very much about thinking the human body just created toxins. And so because the human body created toxins, indeed, I have a wonderful book I should bring in called Your Own Breath is Your Worst Enemy. It was all part of what happened in the 19th century. This sort of incredible sort of concern about body odor was an indication that the body was putrefying, and therefore dilution, mixing air with fresh air, dilution was a way to get all those toxins out of the building. We use that today. That's our means of cooling and heating our buildings, is dilution, based on a 19th century idea about the body. The air handler that we use, patented in 1911, unchanged since 1911. A cooling coil was added, some electronics were added, unchanged from 1911. The actual sort of theory of how heat and air move, 1925. It's the last branch of classical physics to have that theory in place. That's 1925. So we established the whole idea of HVAC systems before the science was there. And we've never gone back. Never gone back to say, maybe this is a bad idea. Maybe using the most inefficient means to move air known to humankind is not a thing we should be doing and calling ourselves sustainable because we've tweaked it a bit. But that's the sort of situation we find ourselves in. The thing is that the technologies are there, the knowledge is there, but somehow we're not collectively beginning to sort of question the things we do or really appropriately bring them in. I love these questions that really push then on the extent of disciplinary knowledge on us. And so, and one of the things is what I've been particularly interested in is sort of breaking the hegemony of the facade. I already showed those images that said facade is everything. Facade is what carries structure. The envelope is what carries structure. That's where all the energy exchanges. We do tremendous amount of activities all around designing the facade because we assume that everything happens on the facade. This was some research I did about, I guess it was now about 6 or 7 years ago, where I worked with electrical engineering in order to better understand, and this was not even about changing the building systems, it was about, we don't even understand the systems we have. We do such a terrible job of calculating energy use in a building. And what we realized is that the whole metric that we use now, which is energy per square foot, all an energy per square foot metric does is privilege a bloated building. Now think about that. Energy per square foot. You make your building larger, but you don't add any more people to it. Well, people are the ones that are actually sort of like responsible for quite a bit. Every computer, the specialty lighting that you might need, the heat load that comes off the body. You spread them out over a larger and larger area, you make the building bigger, your building automatically looks more energy efficient. So a lot of best practices that come through for energy efficiency are actually ones that end up sort of pushing you toward making a bigger building. The total building uses more energy per function. It uses more energy per capita when it's larger. It uses less energy per square foot. And our metric is always per square foot or per a square meter. Matter of fact, the best way, using that system, the system we use today, to make a building look energy efficient, put an atrium in it. Atria are always sort of discussed as things that, oh, this is great, it brings in daylighting, all this kind of, what an atria does better than anything else is it gets rid of people and their loads. If you get rid of people and their loads, the building looks really good on this. So basically, we're privileging things that we shouldn't be privileging because we haven't even developed the right metric. So we developed this 4-part metric and try to sort of, it's actually harder than it looks. Parts of it are relatively easy, but really trying to determine not only sort of like, what do we focus on in a better way, but also if there's going to be subsidies for certain types of things we want to do to a building, where should we focus those subsidies? So it's split into occupant determined loads, things that really were about occupant behavior, and of course the most important thing, computers. You know, a lot of the digital equipment really are not about the way you design your building, and yet they get charged the building. That's why making the building bigger makes you look better, because you're spreading that digital equipment out. Technology determined loads. This is actually where we were hoping, if there was going to be support for people doing things on buildings, we wanted to be able to sort of like deal with where they weren't able to upgrade their technologies. You know, rather than focusing on things that didn't make a difference, where couldn't they upgrade their technologies? Where was efficiency a problem for them? What are the things that really are about building design? What the interior is like, how we light in the interior. Are we lighting as well? If we heating and cooling the most inefficient way, we know how to do it. We also light the most inefficiently way. Lighting and ceiling is insane. You know, I'm not lying down. I'm looking in this direction. We choose an unbelievably clumsy way of sort of like dealing with what's in the field of view. And the result is we use an order of magnitude more lighting than we need to use at the minimum, an order of magnitude more. And of all the things that we deal with, this is the one thing we could change tomorrow. But we are so sort of clinging to the idea that this is the way lighting has to be designed. And it actually has an even more bizarre history than does heating ventilation systems. Now, what's really interesting is sort of looking at the envelope just for what the envelope does, which is deal with sort of direct daylight utilization and climate source and sink. Here's what we discovered, least important part, that these aspects were our major energy consumers. Yet almost all of our attention has been placed on the envelope, insulating the envelope, doing all these different things to the envelope within that. And this has been one that it's been difficult to generalize it because we've been working from data collected from a small subset of buildings. So I'm really hoping at some point to make some traction on this. Questions that understand the difference between causation, determination, and correlation. Really problematic for us as well, the sort of idea that if we have things that correlate, that means that it does cause that. I'd say this is one of the areas we really get ourselves trapped into. So let me just sort of give you a quick example about understanding true causation. A window that's been rotated, it's the same window. So anybody who's actually worked through the algorithms on doing an energy analysis will know that they, according to all the tools that we use in buildings, these are the same. You know, conductivity will tell you that the same window rotated exchanges the same amount of energy. The rotated window exchanges half as much energy, half as much, because it's not all about conduction. And we actually don't have good information that comes into our algorithms to allow us to take into account something quite extraordinary that happens at this particular scale, which is a shift from what is laminar flow to turbulent flow. You shift from laminar flow to turbulent flow, your energy exchange goes up a factor of 10. That happens at about the normative height of our windows. And of course, I can also make it happen by increasing the temperature difference from inside to outside. Every person who's ever studied fluid mechanics knows this. No one who does building analysis knows this. None of the software, none of the simulation tools, none of the energy balance that we do knows this. The fact that I could just rotate a window and I would have saved half the amount of energy coming in that. There's this part of sort of like understanding how things work that, you know, I don't think we should be teaching designers and architects PhD level fluid mechanics. And people who do PhD level fluid mechanics aren't particularly interested in working on buildings. How do you deal with this kind of gap between the two and get that knowledge across? Lesson number 2, black box accounting. We do black box accounting. I think this is what really gets us into trouble. The whole reason why we end up with concepts like net zero energy is because of black box accounting. It actually has very specific origins. It comes about quite directly from the 1973 oil embargo. And it comes about from there because in a panic about sort of the possibility of losing, control of resources, a very sort of like large concern about national security because of that control. They developed this particular calculation system. It's actually sort of reported within this particular document from Congress, how to do energy accounting. The energy accounting here was an input-output model based on exchange. Exchange is to where cash was paid, because that had to do with ownership. And ownership is what they were concerned about in terms of national security. Ownership does not naturally translate into energy behavior, but ownership was what allowed them to sort of account for where something was, not how something was used or how something behaved. And I love this sort of like piece on this that I tried to blow up, although it's such a 1976 document, it was hard to do. But input-output analysis based on economic data on inter-industry transfers in goods and services, blah, 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 by its very nature, cannot be disaggregated downward. And yet, that's precisely what started to happen with the very first types of tools that we had for analyzing buildings, is we started using what's known as the conservative volume. This is a conservative volume approach. This is an input-output analysis. That's why we have things like net zero energy, which are based on that really don't map at all well onto a true energy analysis on it. And even though we talk about things that are much larger, this is not about sort of like the proper way of using input-output analysis either. Just sort of blowing it up, it's still doing the same idea, defining a boundary by ownership. An ownership boundary is never the right place to do a behavioral energy analysis. Something that's dealing with flows is never the right way. That's how all of our analyses take place, by ownership. Whether that ownership is over a product, whether that ownership is over a building, whether that ownership is over a city, a new city, whether that ownership is over our city. We have a tendency to sort of always sort of draw our boundary about our own purview without sort of like thinking and sort of what comes in and goes out without thinking beyond that. One of the other areas where we get really into trouble on this, and I'm just about to wrap up on this, has to do with how we're loose and fast with the actual counting of energy. So you look at this particular image here, and buildings are in the dark blue. And you think, we don't have to worry about buildings. They're in the dark blue, they're not very significant. But of course, the yellow is electricity generation. 75 to 80% of this is buildings. The other big part of that's actually buildings is a lot of the industry is actually buildings. So when you come through this, buildings are responsible for a tremendous amount of the energy that we use, and also responsible for a tremendous amount, this is sort of the fastest growing area, is electricity, tremendous amount of the use of electricity. So when people sort of conveniently start talking about actually the building sector has been very stable, they tend to sort of like select pieces of it that don't consider the whole story. And then the story gets much worse. So finally, in the last IPCC report, they started adding urbanization in this. Karen Cito was the lead on this. If you don't know the work of Karen Cito, it's definitely someone you should follow. She's a geographer who has done some really astonishing modeling analysis of the energy use of urban areas. But anyway, one of the things that they uncovered on this was that nobody had been paying attention to construction. And that when you start thinking about the developing world and the pace of urbanization in the developing world, that the embodied energy in building materials and infrastructure is going to be actually our biggest problem. So this is a bit dense, but basically what they're realizing is that by 2040, 30% of our carbon emissions will come from construction. So the construction associated with urbanization, nobody's been counting that. Nobody's been paying attention to that because construction materials don't get counted to the building sector. Construction materials get counted to the industrial sector. We've never taken account for the embodied energy of our materials. It's always been part of a different sector. So this is sort of the first alarm bell that's sounding about the way that we need to think about the rapid pace of urbanization, how we're building, how we're privileging decisions, and how we're not changing some of the decisions. One of the things, and I hope I can do this before I die, but it's probably going to die first on this. If I could not only improve that metric, but if I could, instead of having people thinking about doing their boundary analyses, their conservative volumes around the building, the town, the neighborhood, and things like that, every sort of decision ought to be weighed this way, at rated forcing, because that's where it really matters, how every decision has an impact at this scale, not an impact in my neighborhood, in my backyard, for what I do on that. And this will also force us to start paying attention to the fact that certain other decisions that, because we've over-focused on carbon dioxide, we've let go of understanding of a lot of these others. And for those of you who study radiative forcing, this roughly also corresponds to knowledge level of impacts. Extremely good knowledge level of the well-mixed greenhouse gases. We start moving down here. I love collecting every one of these that comes out because 20 years ago, almost none of this existed on the radiative forcing mass. They had a really difficult time identifying what these other things are. You know, each time it comes down, they identify more, they learn a little bit more about these different impacts. If that's where we could go, we can make a real difference. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about, whenever we do this conservative volume analysis, when we think about a green product, a green building, a green city, we have lost sight of what it is that sustainability really has its roots in. Our common future, the Brundtland Commission, was the one that developed the first definition of sustainable development. And you read that and you think, okay, you know, I get that. That looks like pretty much what everyone uses on that. That makes sense, you know. Don't compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And again, that's what sort of shows up everywhere and every place that you look at in some version or another. But this is not at all what they were talking about. What the Brundtland Commission was talking about was not the needs of me or my children, not the needs of my community, but the fact of the needs of the developing world versus the developed world. And so this is what they put forward are the things that they were looking at while they were meeting. They were dealing with all the different environmental issues. At the same time, they were dealing with all of these different developmental issues that they put forward. So these are from the time period in which they were working. They were looking at the fact that you could not isolate one from the other. So any sort of decision that we made in the developed world, if it didn't sort of understand what the consequences were in the developing world, we weren't thinking about the needs of the future. We were only thinking about our own needs. And by the same token, the realization that in the developing world, moving forward requires this sort of like movement. The only path we know is a movement through industrialization. That movement through industrialization will take them into being even greater polluters, even greater emitters of greenhouse gases, which puts a much larger onus on the developed world to significantly cut back in order to allow the developing world to move forward. On the 20th anniversary of the report coming out, I organized a symposium and invited Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was the chair of that, to be the keynote speaker. It was a sort of a stunning talk, a sort of reflecting back on 20 years of what did or did not happen as a result. And I'll never forget the question and answer session at the end where people in the audience, you know, kept saying like, oh, but nuclear power, that'll solve it. How about seeding the upper atmosphere with SO2? That'll solve it. You know, that they wanted from her that heroic solution. They wanted for her to say everything was going to be okay. You just have to do this. And by the way, not you, somebody else is going to be doing it. Someone just has to do this thing, and we'll all be safe. You know, it'll all happen, it'll all work out. And I don't think I've ever been more inspired in my life than by an answer that she gave, and sort of extending on this particular quote from her talk, you know, about the fact that sustainability was not something you could achieve. It was a series of sort of like decisions being made among things that had all problematic consequences, hoping that with each decision, things would get a little better and you would learn a little bit more. She says, that's what we hope for, that we're going to find our path moving forward by continuing to analyze, continue to think, continue to negotiate. She says, but you know, we don't have answers, but we can always keep asking the questions. If there may not be any heroic solutions, but there are true heroes within that. And she's probably one of my greatest heroes. So I don't know if I have time for this one or not, because this is a whole new part that I'm very excited about. Maybe would another 5 minutes be okay on this? Because this is not even my area. I'm just so blown away by it. I'm absolutely fascinated. I had a chance to hear a lecture from a lawyer/psychologist who deals with cultural cognition. And I'm sure many of you have heard a lot about cultural cognition, but his particular interest was in sort of like science deniers. And one of the things he noticed, and sort of a couple of different things that he has there, that he was talking about this sort of very well-known meteorologist, and that if you read one of his papers, you're going to find both of these statements in here, that it is now beyond reasonable scientific dispute that human activity is causing global warming. But he also said, judged by conventional scientific standards, it's premature to conclude that. So a difference between sort of like consensus versus what would be the standard that people would use. Both of those were in this particular thing. So what happened is that depending upon which of those quotes you saw, you determined whether or not he was a good scientist. So people who were of a particular political persuasion, who saw that he said it was premature, said, can't trust him. He's not a good scientist. People who read the high-risk one first were exactly in different political persuasion, can't trust him. You know, he's not a good scientist. People were definitely sort of like weighing what they were reading based on sort of like that first bit of information that came to them, and then making a decision about the quality of who was writing it in relationship to whether or not it matched their beliefs. So this sort of approach to cultural cognition looks at how your beliefs, and the beliefs might be moral, they might be religious, they can come political, they can come from a variety of different places, but they do affect the way that you process information. But it gets more interesting from there. So it's not just sort of about who they're willing to listen to. It's going to be in terms of which things will cause that shift and which things don't. So things like global warming, guns, fracking cause that shift. Basically what we'd call a cherry picking kind of shift. You know, whether or not you believe or think things are in a particular way. A bunch of other things, no. They no matter what your background is, you feel the same way about artificial sweeteners and diet soft drinks. They're just tasty. You know that. They're just tasty. Bad for you, but tasty. And then the next step, and I think this is the toughest one for those of us in academia to deal with, and it's my last slide, I think. Yes, it's my last slide. It's the toughest thing for those of us in academia to deal with. We will always say that, you know, we just need to educate people. If we educate people, they will make better decisions. Actually, no. Actually, no. And that's what this next slide talks about. So go back to the ones that caused that kind of sort of difference of opinion. So if the other one was about political leaning, this is about knowledge. Whether you have no knowledge of something or whether you are sort of extremely well educated on that. what it's showing is that for the things that trigger the moral, religious, or political things, the more knowledge you have, the more you diverge. You don't converge and come to the same conclusion, you actually diverge. And the reason is that you're more adept and more able to read through the material, and you respond to the things that connect to your political, moral, or religious viewpoint on that. What this has left me with is, I'd say where I'm going now has a lot to do with whom I communicate. How do I get things moving forward with audiences that have radically different belief systems and backgrounds? I spent Tuesday and Wednesday meeting with different members of the state legislature. And, thinking like, I'm going to talk to everybody. I'm going to figure out how to have this conversation with as many people as I can. And what would be the way to neutralize, things? How do you sort of avoid landing up there immediately? And how do you keep it at this level where actually people continue in consensus the more they learn about something, the more that they agree on that? I think this is one of the most important things for us to be able to do within our set of fields. We may not own a lot of this knowledge, but we can certainly be conveners. We can be the arbiters in many ways. We are one of the few sets of fields that deal with people from all different backgrounds, that deal with so many different domains. I really am quite excited about sort of this opportunity to begin to understand sort of the greater complexities, but as well, hopefully, the greater fruits of learning to speak to a very, very different kind of audience. So what's kind of funny and sort of tying us all together, Michael sort of like talked about looking at my work 9 years ago, where I was pretty adamant that, pretty much anybody else writing about the field was not as smart as I was. And if they would just do things my way, we would be able to fix this world. I'm not there anymore. And I'm actually way more interested now in sort of like stepping back and understanding how we sort of negotiate a path forward, knowing that, where we might have faulty information, I'm not going to be able to correct all that. Knowing that we've got all these sort of like twists and turns within it, how do we find and sort of like choreograph, that movement forward? So that's where I am. I apologize for running over. Generally, once I'm talking, I'm not stopped. So you have to interrupt me for that. But I have time for some questions. I'd be delighted to answer any questions. And I'm sorry I know you all, you're on a tight schedule. I apologize for keeping you.
Questions?
And I feel like one thing that I've been adjusting to in architecture school is how sometimes our research can feel pretty non-rigorous.
Feel? Just feel?
But I do want to have this kind of emphasis in my career, but I'm more interested in the design aspect than being an academic necessarily. So do you have any thoughts on how somebody might bring it into their practice?
Well, I think this is really an interesting question, because we're going to find more and more people from, all different kinds of backgrounds that bring specialized knowledge into play. And, how it is that in a process that really is supposed to be about, rigorous decision making all the way through, understanding that in each decision you make in the design process, there is that sort of moment for every single decision that's highly subjective within that. And the thought that of how we would be able to bring in the kind of knowledge, I think, is not easily answered within sort of our normative design process. I've been really interested in following firms that have decided that they were going to go down the route of actually sort of, aggressively developing new simulation tools, technologies, and materials. And while I often think that They're not challenging some of the things I wish they were challenging. They've chosen their path very well. You all probably remember, some of you would remember Billy Faircloth, who taught here some years ago, who is running a research group at Kieran Timberlake. I'd say they ask some of the best questions that I've seen there. Are they asking some of the questions I wish they were asking? No. Are they asking amazing questions about certain material decisions and things like that? Unbelievably so. I think that sort of the next generation that we're going to deal with in design is going to start to see how different firms, different research groups are going to start sort of taking off a piece of this. Then it's not going to be that we're going to be able to pull it all together as a singular thing, but if we can bring rigor to even one piece of it, I think that's a critical start that we have here. My great hope for my students is that if to sort of step back and start asking the why between everything. Why is this like this? Why is this sort of, why am I using this? Why is this like that? And I think if we can even start introducing that culture into design, we're going to start making a little bit of progress. I wish I had the heroic answer for that one, though. Yeah. So, okay, I guess you were first, yeah.
Regarding my question, three quick five questions. How do we know we can trust energy on top of like Open Studio, Request, when you stated that based off of standards, based off of inaccurate or incomplete data has been cited time over time? And then how can I trust any of the data you presented? You said that a lot of that standard, world standard, is based on 12 houses data. And lastly, do you recommend professionals should be re-educated?
Okay, let me answer the second question first. On the 12 houses, I did the work to find the original paper. That's actually something I learned as a doctoral student, was often being given things that I didn't understand where they came from and tracking down the original writer, the original source, and finding that. The data part of it is that, and it makes me an annoying person to work on grants and things like that. I always ask for raw data, and then I want to see algorithms. I don't want someone to say, by the way, this is how it's modeled. So I ask for that for every software. I want to walk. You shouldn't have to do that. You know, you shouldn't have to look at the algorithms, and you shouldn't have to go through the raw data to see where they were getting the data, how they were collecting it, what was being included within the algorithms, what the sensitivity analysis, all those types. You shouldn't have to do that, but I think we're going to have to start identifying certain gatekeepers along the way that will do that. One of my great concerns is that I used to have very good relationships with the Department of Energy, and there was a real free flowing sharing of data and information. And it was also very easy. They would always send you the raw data that you could work with. You know, over the last several years, most of the scientists have been pushed out, and so like the last guy that I dealt with who does the energy, runs the energy group for them, is actually a historian. Nothing about historians there, but when you ask for an algorithm, and you know, his response is, we have a software for that. No. What's the algorithm behind the software? And you get caught in these kinds of loops. I think as a set of professions, we're going to have to start identifying what some of these key nodes are that we have to have additional information on. And I'm not sure what your third question was.
Is how much do you think the professionals, based on what they've been taught in the past, should be go back to school? That's not something based on the standards they may have been misled that they were taught when they were younger.
I think that this is one of the things that is really exciting to be in education now, is that, you know, the knowledge and the skills that the people who are graduating come out with are really changing almost all of those firms for the better. And I think it's something that we're probably not going to re-educate them, but they're going to be very responsive and continue to be very responsive to who we send to them. I think that's where it is. Yes.
On this idea, what was it, the conservative framing? Or?
Conservative volume.
Conservative volume. I was just thinking, and this is like anytime I think an architect speaks to a group of planners, one of the planners raises their hand and says, well, what about the stuff outside the building? So that's this question.
Right.
On your multi-metric framework, it made me think about an additional metric, which would be, for example, you have all these buildings being built in Austin that are super green, they have trails around them, they all have solar panels, but they're 20 miles away, and the VMTs for these buildings is going to be astounding. And so maybe another version of those metrics could be, what is the behavior of interacting with your community versus the behavior of how you engage with the building?
I'm with you on that. One of the reasons why we started on this metric for the building was to get people to stop using energy per square foot, because that really has taken us down a very problematic road. So one of the reasons why, our energy use continues to increase in buildings, there have been a lot of good things that have been done to buildings. They really have. But if we're going to continue to make them larger, we're erasing that automatically. So that really was focused on something that people who dealt with that type of thing would start including in. We're getting a little bit of traction, and at least the electrical load responsible for plug loads. That's all they're talking about now, stripping out of it, but at least taking the plug load stuff out of it is moving in the right direction. I think that what's going to be difficult for us is, once you start sort of like looking at direct versus indirect domains within energy use, it gets a lot harder to find a unifying model for that. I would be more a fan of thinking about these as existing simultaneously, that they layer on top of each other. You figure out the moment at which they sort of like intervene, as opposed to sort of coming up with a comprehensive everything tied together one. I do think that would be, it's a way that we do a lot of things multi-system wise in engineering, would be layers and layers. Boom, this is the moment at which you actually do that vertical slice through that. Complicated, but I do think if we can get the right people together, we could start finding where is that moment that we actually sort of like pull them together. And it may not even be pulled together. It might be a scenario waiting. That might be where those kinds of things come into play. Yes?
I want to know what your response would be to someone who says that this kind of thinking is at best, or it either compromises or is antithetical to some sort of aesthetic or form-based project, prerogative, objective.
Well, I think,
We could talk even just about the rotation of a window, for example.
yeah. No, and actually,
Take it out of the sight line.
right. So I use that rotation of window to show we don't have any sort of algorithms right now that sort of take that into account. I can make any window behave like a rotated window. So if you take it to the next level, it's actually really easy to take single pane glass and have it behave like it's triple pane. Easy to take a vertical window and make it behave like it's rotated. So the most straightforward part is if you don't know the science of how it works, you can at least move the window. But when you start understanding the fluid mechanics of where sinks and sources occur, you can actually make that window behave in a different way. I will say that I started all this because I thought we had put too much emphasis on clumsy form, and trying to embed decisions in clumsy form. And I certainly wasn't a fan of the stuff that came out in the 70s. And I wanted to free up the building and free up the designers, that if we started designing sort of like the behavioral interactions for the body and for the eye, we actually would give much more design freedom to the building within that, when it was no longer these clumsy facades, these clumsy HVAC systems, ridiculous lighting systems. I'm no longer a Pollyanna on this. It's kind of shifting, like if I could just do a couple of little things now, I'll be happy. But that was what began it, is that buildings could be lighter, thinner, much more freedom in terms of form. Orientation is one of those that makes me nuts in terms of what orientation, the weight that orientation has been given in daylighting, which it doesn't deserve, because it isn't sort of causally connected in the way people think it is. There's so many things that would free it up. So that's my answer to that, is that actually I'm doing you a big favor.
Well, it's not me.
I know, you in general, yeah.
But I
Yeah, I found the opposite. I found that most of the people I've collaborated with somehow really enjoy the opportunities that come out. And it's some of the strangest bedfellows you can imagine. I worked with Preston Scott Cohen, where he loved the idea that he could actually open up his entire building and we could selectively create warm and cool zones without him having to have walls. You know, and not hard. You just have to move those vertically, but not hard to do. I don't even want to share working with Peter Eisenman on a building. But you know, it can range in that particular kind of way that Peter was particularly shocked. For years he would, no matter what he lectured on, Palladio, it didn't matter, he'd always end it by saying, and sustainability is ruining architecture. He always ended that way. And then I think he was sheepishly had to do a competition where it required a sustainability board. So we actually worked on the Helsinki Guggenheim together. And you know, he was shocked. He says, you mean I don't have to do this? You mean I don't have to have a big glazed wall just to get light in? I said, no, Peter, you know, you can really design how you want to design. And believe it or not, I can do some really imaginative things here. Now, we didn't win because his design wasn't good, but the sustainability part was awesome on that. So it's been interesting that I think they're a lot more responsive than you can imagine at a certain level. They're not going to be responsive if you say, by the way, I'm in control of your orientation, I'm in control of your form, I'm in control of your materials. But if you say, no, I can actually work within that, they'll be a lot more responsive. Yes, Ming?
Yeah, you showed this building performance in terms of the energy performance or emission performance in individual buildings. And who are doing those research, look at a cluster of buildings or this building performance within different built environmental contexts. The Lucan building performs the same within the downtown context or if it's in the middle of the Greenfield. In particular, I guess I'm interested in different types of larger area than individual buildings. It's a simple addition of individual buildings or?
It's not an addition of individual buildings. And I think this is something that if I could do anything to sort of like break the hold of the conservative volume and the idea of property ownership, it's beginning to understand, I'd say the two things I'm most interested in. One is understanding sink-source relationships, which will tend to be over a much larger area. That if you understand sinks and sources, what you can do in terms of community and neighborhood, all of that, you reduce energy load before you even start sort of needing energy within that. So I think there's so many things like that that have to be thought, again, at the appropriate sort of domain of a particular kind of energy behavior, which is going to be over sort of like it's just not going to map neatly on property. You know, property is the one thing that energy is not going to map neatly on. So I'm very interested in things like that. I had a project a number of years ago in Ecuador where we were looking at how we could deal with sort of thinking about, not that I really wanted to work on a whole new town construction, but really beginning to understand exactly how we sort of like maintain not only sort of the larger site conditions along the way, maintain the type of greenhouse sinks that we wanted to maintain, but at the same time, in the way that we thought about the siting, just drop the energy load before we even started building. You can do that, and we have to start thinking about that. The other part, and this is a project that didn't go through, we didn't get the funding for. I've always regretted that we didn't get funding for this. But I'm really interested in what I'd call sort of like these hybrid things that solve one person's problem but provide a greater public good. So this was a project in India where many of you who are familiar with Bangalore know that the energy use in Bangalore is going up 10% a year, sort of the brownouts that are occurring, and all of this is because of transnational software companies. They have the money to buy private power. Having them buy private power is doing no one any good. You know, it's doing them good, but it's not doing any well. So we were working with United Technologies on fuel cells for private power, knowing that if we worked with fuel cells, that we could also use it to clean water. And so the thought was, okay, go ahead and let them have their uninterruptible private power, but darn it, they're going to provide clean water for the community in doing that. And it was a way of actually sort of reducing it was actually a way of sort of like dealing with the tremendous heat load that comes off of a fuel cell and then using that in that particular way. I'm really interested in how projects that, you know, particularly understand who can pay and whether or not who can pay can have this kind of bonus benefit or corollary benefit for those who cannot. I think that's one of the most interesting areas for us to start working on. But definitely we have to, so many of these phenomena do not exist at a building level, which has been all of this work, is stop thinking about this at a building level. Yeah. Okay, I think.
I think this is a really nice lecture. I think it should be like more like a TED Talk or SASPI. The reason I'm saying that is because the major barrier I see for this to move forward is like people's perception or knowledge about what is right or wrong. I think if you have a client who does not understand just what you said, this shouldn't be that way and this can be done that way. If we can educate more and more people, let them know what is right and what is wrong, that will solve a big barrier for this to move forward.
But we got to figure out this part. We got to figure out this part. Yeah. All right. Thank you.